Speeton. That's what we're going to talk about for a few minutes today. 2 or 3 stories from an amazing place that gets little to no publicity apart from what it's received from the Truth Proof books. Small village between East and North Yorkshire. It kind of sits on the border. It's on top of the cliffs, which in that particular part of East Yorkshire are about 400 feet. So, and they're pretty inaccessible. You can reach the beach from Reeton. It's about a mile's walk down the coast, but you don't spend long on the beach, not at high tide. It often gets cut off and it's quite treacherous. So the first account, I think it's 1980, I first wrote about it in one of the Truth Proof books, Truth Proof 3 I believe, and it's a young boy who's come with his mum and dad, and they're staying at Reeton, the holiday camp, and he asks his mum if on this particular evening, and his dad obviously, if he can light a fire on the beach further down and stay out alone. Apparently his older brother used to do this, and it's something he always craved doing. Well, his older brother weren't with them this year. He'd sort of grown out of going on holiday with his mum and dad, and they allowed him reluctantly. So I think he was only about 14, 15 years old. And he walks down towards the mighty cliffs of Speeton, which they are imposing. They're absolutely 400-foot sheer drop, white cliffs, and lights a small fire. He's sat just minding his own business, probably thinking he's an adult, he's king of the world at this particular moment, 14, 15 years old, alone with a fire on the beach. And suddenly, to his right, as he looks down the cliffs, he becomes aware of a luminous sphere that's midpoint on the cliffs, meaning it's about 200 foot in the air, which is brilliant because we can estimate this with these cliffs. And it's away from the cliffs 20 feet. And he's watching it, can't understand what it is. He's absolutely perplexed. Definitely not the moon, even though it looked like the moon. That's the kind of size that you were getting off this thing when you look at the moon on a full moon. So it must have looked quite spectacular. Then he realised it's slowly moving down the coast towards him, and he's only probably 500 yards away from it, because he's sat just before the base of these cliffs where they start. He becomes fearful. Forgot all about his fire now, gathers whatever he's brought with him and sets off moving down the beach. Turning round, this thing's moving towards him. All the time it's getting closer. Sets off running because initially fear becomes full-blown panic. And the cliffs then, as we go down towards Reeton, they turn into like clay and earth cliffs. They've gone from rock, and there's little outcrops where the sea's eroded them, and he tucks in behind one of these outcrops of clay and sits and waits because he expects this sphere to pass. And no, what he's expecting, he's no idea. He's never experienced anything like this in his life. What seems like ages, which in effect were probably just a few minutes, nothing happens. So he just ventures out, pokes his head round the corner, looks up the coast towards where this thing had been. Nothing. It's completely gone. You can just see the sort of glowing light of his fire in the distance. So an interesting story. Totally silent white sphere, which when standing alone you think to yourself, that's just one account, it's just one strange account, but then you realise in this particular stretch of coastline many accounts have come out of this area, and I've only discovered that whilst compiling information for the Truth Proof books. During 2019 I found myself visiting Bempton Cliffs once again with Bob Brown. If it's not Bob, it's either Bob or Steve Ashbridge or Andy Ramsden. But whilst I was there was a few people milling around bird spotting, because as everybody knows it's a bird sanctuary. But one of the bird spotters sought me out. He must have recognised me and as the guy who talks about unexplained phenomena. And he explained to me that he lived in Scarborough and he'd got a story that he'd like to share. And I never expected to hear such a story on a summer's evening when we're just going out for a little bit of a stroll. I think we're going back to the 1990s. 1998 springs to mind, and I have documented it in a truth proof book, but let's not hold fast on the actual date. Let's just concentrate on content of story. And he's told me that on occasions, once a week, he would pick his daughter up and take her to the amusements in Scarborough, and then they'd go for a drink in a cafe or a pub. In this particular instance, there's got a great big sort of summer house that looks out onto the sea, and you can see up the coast towards Speeton and Bempton. So once again, we're off to Speeton with this account. He said they sat there, it's evening time, it's getting dark. They'd done what they were doing. His daughter had got some pop and a little bit of something to eat, and he's having a beer. And there's a few people in this summer house. And he looks up the cliffs, he's facing that way with his chair, and he sees a sphere of light seem to come from the face of the cliff. We know it's a long way away, we're looking a good distance here, we're probably looking at least 15 to 18 miles. So it's hard to estimate, it could have been even further away, it could have been round the corner at Bempton. But he's telling the story, he believes it was Speeton. Then he sees another one come out, then another, and once again, people, we can get an estimate of height that these things were off the ground, because we know that we're talking about 400 to 420 foot cliffs, and we're midpoint, we're about 200 foot above the sea. And he's watching these things until approximately 5 or 6 lights are out in a row over the sea. There's a red light in the middle above all of them, and there's a gap between all of them that's equal. So we've got these huge luminous white spheres. Now, he believes they were all one solid object, because he said they all moved in unison. He says it was all as though they were swept across the sea and then swept back like the hand of a clock. And he could see this happening. He couldn't understand it. It attracted the attention of the other people in the cafe or the public house, and they were all watching this weird spectacle. His daughter's watching it, and then they retracted back, seemingly into the cliffs. I need to say right away now that I don't believe that there's some kind of underground base at Speeton and UFOs are somehow cloaking and dissolving into the cliff face. He's just telling a story, and that's what it looked like to him. Now, before we end, I asked him to give us an approximate estimation of its length, this assuming it's one solid object, and I walked with him back up to the RSPB reserve. They were going, we just bumped into them as we arrived, and he's still telling me the story. Now, before we set off on the journey, he sort of stepped back, he kept stepping backwards. He's trying to give me an estimation, and he says about from here to the reserve. That's what he thought. We're going back a lot of years. It could be way out in his estimations, but basically it's big. So I followed him back up and I paced it out, however many paces it was, and it equated to just under 1,000 foot. They were 991 feet or something, measurements that I'd taken. So we've got an incredible object or objects appearing over the sea once again. Unlikely place, Speeton. And is it unlikely? I say that and I contradict myself, because who goes to Speeton in the winter? Yes, you get rock anglers who'll climb down, it's treacherous. It'll probably take you 20 minutes to go down when you've parked your car at Speeton Church. But you're not going to spend any length of time down there. It's very remote. It's very lonely. What would UFOs be doing down there? I mean, that's the big question. But what would UFOs be doing anywhere? Let's ask ourselves that one. I mean, we don't have to know the reasons that these things are presenting. But more stories to come from Speeton.